the Future Consciousness Insights newsletter once or twice a month. And here's images of the various books I have published in the areas of future studies and consciousness and psychology and wisdom and science fiction. Today we are going to be doing module 3 in the evolution of science fiction. Ancient history through the Middle Ages, 1000 BC or BCE to 1500 after the Common Era. And I have a quote up here from Aristotle. Those who are now renowned have taken over as if in a relay race, from hand to hand, relieving one another from many, many predecessors who on their part progress and thus have themselves made possible progress. And somebody might ask, well, what's the point of going back to ancient history of the Middle Ages and thinking about the evolution of science fiction? Well, science fiction is something which evolved out of ancient thinking, ancient philosophy, ancient myth, and to see the various themes and ideas and concepts that have worked themselves into modern science fiction, it's important to go back to the early history, because the earlier history set the foundations for the ongoing evolution of science fiction in modern times. I have up there 2 images. The one on the left is Prometheus stealing fire from the gods to give it to humanity, and the one on the right is an image of the Greek mythological god Hephaestus, who is the god of metallurgy and is credited with having invented various kinds of automata and robots. And in fact, the Greeks had a mythology of technology with Hephaestus at the center of it. And I'll be talking about Hephaestus and Prometheus as we move through this module. As you know, this series is based on my Evolution of Science Fiction, the Evolutionary Mythology of the Future book series. And Prometheus to the Martians has been published and 2 others have been written, and the other 2 I'm working on. I should mention that today, the module, if you're interested, is based on chapter 3 in volume 1, Prometheus to the Martians. And it has actually the same title, Ancient History Through the Middle Ages. So if you're interested in reading in more depth about what I talk about today, it comes out of volume 1, chapter 3. Now, what I introduced last time, and I will do this for every module into the future, is I'll do a little quick review of the previous module so you can get oriented and get a sense of where we were coming from last time and where we're heading now in the present module. So last time I talked about the history and nature of myth and fantasy and what the differences were between myth, fantasy, and science fiction. I pointed out that in ancient times, we had various narratives and stories and oral traditions that described fantastic beings with fantastic powers and fantastic settings participating in fantastic and cosmic events. And so that heritage of imaginative speculation and mind-stretching thinking goes all the way back to ancient myths, and that forms one of the foundational elements to contemporary science fiction, which often has fantastic beings with fantastic powers and fantastic settings participating in fantastic events. And I brought up as a concept or definition of myth that myth is the credible and inspiring transcendent, and it will express fundamental worldviews and values of a particular culture. And in that sense, we don't even think of myths as being false or fictitious. We think of them as, at the time, being plausible or credible and inspiring and dealing with the transcendent. And they will express in them various fundamental ideas and concepts and values of that culture. And I compared the qualities of myth with the mythic qualities of science fiction and pointed out that all of the mythic qualities of ancient myths line up with similar dimensions or qualities in science fiction. Now, there are differences between ancient myth and fantasy and science fiction, but they're relative differences. And to use the concept of evolution here to understand this, I would say that our historical evolution is a combination of continuity and change. And so science fiction builds upon ancient myth and brings with it various elements, but then at the same time, it also has new elements that come in. And when you look at science fiction, you'll see sometimes science fiction is very much more in tune with mythic and fantasy thinking, and other times it's less so. But that's because science fiction is rich. So what we have today is a combination of our heritage plus new elements added in. And I said that science fiction, in fact, is our contemporary myths about the future. They deal with the future, for the future. And they're for the future because they expand our future consciousness and they inspire us to create and act. And science fiction will do that. They'll engage people into action and invention. I brought up the idea that science fiction goes beyond the future, and that science fiction also deals with alternative realities, and told you about the concept of the Jambor point, which frequently comes up in science fiction, where one little change in reality could send the future off into different directions, and how science fiction was evolutionary mythology, and that it evolves and it's inspired by evolution, and it stimulates evolution at the same time. And I used the example of science fiction dealing with the future evolution of humanity and how that has evolved. And then there were a lot of key authors and books that I talked about, Joseph Campbell and Pynchon and Burroughs and Bester and Philip Dick and Doc Smith and Star Wars and Matrix. So all of that's just a quick review of what came up in Module 2. So now in Module 3, we're going to build on that. And I'm going to focus in on ancient Greek mythology. Now, if you're interested, I'll mention in a moment, I have another resource for you where I talk about other types of mythologies besides ancient Greek, but I'm going to focus on the Greeks because, in fact, they are the philosophical, intellectual core, center, inspiration of Western civilization. And I'm going to talk about ancient Greek philosophy and science. And in particular, I'm going to talk about Prometheus and the myth of Prometheus and why it is so important both in ancient Greek mythology and in modern science fiction. That story has inspired and served as an archetype for a tremendous amount of contemporary science fiction. And I'm going to introduce you to, in case you've never heard of, Lucian's True History, which is the first well-articulated and very imaginative story of journeying into outer space and aliens. And this was written in the 1st century BC. And then we'll talk about visions of the future in ancient and medieval times. And I'm going to highlight here the concept of the idea of the Battle of Armageddon, which has also been an archetypal image in the history of the evolution of science fiction, and very influential. And I'm going to bring in Dante's Divine Comedy, which in fact has direct relevance into the evolution of science fiction, was the greatest literary creation of Europe during the Middle Ages, coming right at the end of the Middle Ages. And I'll talk about medieval and Renaissance philosophy, science, and science fiction, because there was, in fact, some science fiction going on during the Middle Ages. And I will end with a bit of a discussion on Hieronymus Bosch and his fantastical art, because science fiction, of course, includes a visual dimension And Hieronymus Bosch is a good anchor point regarding how artists can get extremely bizarre and imaginative and fantastical in their works. And I want to mention here now in the book that I wrote, The Evolution of Future Consciousness, and it's up on my website under the heading of Future Consciousness. There's a big chapter on ancient myth, religion, and philosophy, where I get into Eastern philosophies and modes of spirituality like Hinduism and Taoism and Buddhism, as well as the ancient Greek mythology. And I also get into Islam and Christianity and Judaism as well. So all of that I discuss in that book in the context of the evolution of future consciousness. And so if you're interested in getting a bigger perspective on how ancient myths, religions, and forms of spirituality feed into our thinking on the future and how they in fact might influence our thinking on science fiction, I'd recommend go looking at that chapter. It's a big, long chapter. But it's there and it's free and it's on the web. So let's begin. Ancient Greek mythology. And up here I have some images. In the center of them is the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who's important when we think about the ancient Greeks. But right above Nietzsche are statues of the Greek gods Apollo and Dionysus. And there's also images up there from the Odyssey and from Jason and the Argonauts. Now, I'm going to present to you the argument that science fiction, as it evolved, reflected the evolution of human consciousness, and in particular, future consciousness. That is, when we look at what science fiction would become, it illustrates certain fundamental dimensions or archetypes within the very evolution of human consciousness itself. And one in particular I want to highlight right at the beginning is what Nietzsche, the philosopher up there, referred to as the Apollonian versus the Dionysian dimensions of Greek mythology and thinking. The god Apollo was the god of reason and light and order. The god Dionysus was the god of sensation and pleasure and reverie. The Apollonian versus the Dionysian can be described, as Nietzsche did, as two fundamental dimensions in ancient Greek thinking, one of which was represented and personified by the god Apollo, that is the rational side of human consciousness, the rational mind. The other side, represented by Dionysus, embodied and represented the emotional and sensory side. Also, in one sense, Apollo represented order, whereas Dionysius represented chaos. Now, these two elements, these two archetypes, these two fundamental dimensions of human consciousness show up in the ancient Greeks in that they both had rationality and various mental processes associated with that they highlighted, but they also had a sensational, emotional dimension to their consciousness and to their works of art and philosophy. This distinction between reason and emotion in our consciousness will come down 2,000 years later in two philosophical movements, the Western Enlightenment versus Western Romanticism. The Greeks also, connected to that, engaged in abstract thinking on one hand, and thus are a source, a fundamental source of science and abstract philosophy, but they equally engaged in personified thinking, which I talked about last time as being essential to myth. So in ancient Greek consciousness, we see this polarity. And this polarity is significant in the evolution of science fiction, because evolution in science fiction is actually a synthesis in ways of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey embodies or represents one of the most influential, if not influential, fantastical journeys that has mythic elements in it, involving various gods and goddesses and various strange creatures that both influenced humanity, instigating the siege of Troy, and hounded and facilitated and interacted with Odysseus in his journey back to Ithaca after the siege of Troy. Homer's Odyssey in particular can be seen as an archetype of the fantastic voyage where we have a hero who moves through a strange land with his comrades on a ship, and you could translate that into a spaceship in modern times, where strange beings are encountered and he's tested, and it's a hero's journey. And a lot of science fiction is, in fact, hero's journeys in outer space as opposed to across the Mediterranean Sea. So the Odyssey in particular provides a fundamental inspirational starting point for lots of fantastical voyages and hero's journeys that would emerge in science fiction over the coming 2,000 years. A second one that's a hero's journey that's very famous is Jason and the Argonauts. And again, we have humans traveling with a hero in a ship where they encounter strange beings and have to in various ways confront them, and something is being searched for, and enlightenment is realized at the end of the process. So these two stories, and there are others, but these two are very influential in the history of Western thinking, provide archetypal foundations for fantastical voyages, heroes' journeys, enlightenment and discovery that come out of ancient Greek mythology and would serve as a basis for lots of things to come later in science fiction. The classic and beginning point of the articulation of Greek mythology is from Hesiod and his Theogony. And you could read a lot more about Hesiod by looking in my book, but one thing I want to point out about Hesiod is that Hesiod gives you a chronology of how existence came to be, beginning from chaos. And he personifies the various forces that go into the articulation and emergence of our world, eventually coming to the creation of the Titans. And the Titans were giant, mythic, godlike beings, one of whom was Cronus, who was the father of Zeus. And Zeus usurped the power of Cronus and threw him into the sky. And Zeus ruled the Olympian gods through the powers of sex and war. He was lustful and he was violent. And those two qualities of his personality are very significant in visions that we have of power and procreation and the way the universe works. And Zeus, in the story of usurping the power of his father, lays down another archetypal theme of narratives where the children eventually transcend the parents and become independent of the parents. And that's going to be something significant also in the evolution of science fiction. But you can look at the Theogony and see how there's abstract elements in it, but there's mythological elements in it as well. And it provided the fundamental mythic stories for ancient Greece. Now, as I mentioned before, just to repeat, in Greek mythology and other mythologies, the world was enchanted, the world was personified. And in fact, when Greeks thought from a mythic mindset or from a mythic consciousness, they saw personalities in nature, they saw personalities transcending nature, they had their extreme assortment of various gods and goddesses who controlled all the forces of nature. And there's an interesting book by Julian Jaynes, as some of the viewers may be familiar with, written quite a while ago, called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, in which Jaynes argues that prior to about 1 to 2000 BC, it was the normal mode of consciousness to converse with deities and spirits and gods and goddesses and dead relatives in one's conscious mind. That is, hearing voices and having images was a normal mode of consciousness. And this would explain the mythic dimension of human consciousness back at that time in our history. That this is what was normal, that we saw the world, we understood the world, we experienced the world. Indeed, our consciousness was populated with voices and beings, and we projected and saw it out into the world. So mythology may be connected up with a fundamental feature of ancient human consciousness, and it's not entirely gone away either. Although a lot of people who have the voices in their head and see the visions are put in mental hospitals now. And as I mentioned, I'll just mention it again, that Greek myth in the form of fantastic voyages like the Odyssey and Jason and the Argonauts provided a basic archetype for outer space science fiction in traveling out into strange and unknown lands, having a hero, having ships that move about through the unknown reality and encounter strange beings and learn and grow through the process. So the archetype of the outer space adventure actually goes all the way back to Jason and the Argonauts and the Odyssey. Now let's flip the coin over and look at the Apollonian side of the Greek conscious mind. Look at science, technology, and philosophy during the period of ancient Greece. A lot of people will argue that somewhere around 700 BC, a shift takes place in human consciousness, away from the mythic toward the theoretic. So instead of humans being inclined to interpret reality in terms of stories and personified beings, humans begin to interpret reality in terms of abstract concepts that are depersonified. And the axial age is referred to as that point in time when this shift in human consciousness takes place. Now, a reason for highlighting it here is if we look at contemporary science fiction, and contemporary science fiction has mythic elements in it, we could also say that it's an offspring of the theoretic, of the philosophical scientific elements as well. And it brings the two together. And so in the evolution of the human mind, we presumably went through mystical, mythic, and theoretic modes of consciousness. And when we get to science fiction, we see that indeed science fiction embodies in it, at the very least, the mythic and the theoretic, and it may also involve, at least at times, the mystical, say, for example, like in The Matrix and in Star Wars. The contrast we could draw here as ancient Greek science and philosophy emerged after 700 BC was, instead of seeing the world in supernatural terms, we saw the world in natural terms. Instead of personification, we saw things in terms of abstractions. Instead of revelatory and prophetic visioning, we saw things in a rational mode. And finally, instead of seeing the gods as moving us around and influencing us, we began to take responsibility for our own behavior. And in fact, that's one of Jaynes' main arguments, is that prior to 700 BC or 1000 BC, or whatever number you want to pick, humans didn't take responsibility for their behavior. In fact, they thought that the gods and goddesses and spirits were really moving them and directing them. So there's this shift going on from supernatural to natural, personified to abstract, gods to responsibility, that's occurring, especially we see it in ancient Greece. Because in ancient Greece, we get a whole slew of philosophers, pre-Socratic philosophers before Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who began to try to explain the universe in terms of natural, abstract, scientific terms. And again, it's important to keep in mind, insofar as science fiction is informed and inspired by contemporary science, that mode of consciousness goes back to and begins in the axial age with ancient Greek philosophers and early scientists, and probably other parts of the world too, but I'm just highlighting out the Greeks. But the early Greek philosophers before Socrates would often mix together the mythic and the natural. So in Empedocles, who was an ancient Greek philosopher who believed that there were four fundamental elements: earth, fire, air, and water. Sounds naturalistic, scientific. He also thought that the fundamental conflict in nature was between love and hate, which is a personification. And in fact, he thought the dimension of hate was embodied within Ares, the god of war, and the dimension of love was embodied or personified in Aphrodite, the god of love. And so the pre-Socratics would often mix together, even when they were trying to be abstract and philosophical, the mythic. Greek astronomy actually moved along pretty far in early ancient times, to the point where there were actually views that the Earth really wasn't the center of the universe, and that the stars and the planets up above could possibly be other worlds. And this is going to be a very significant idea when we finally get to the modern era and outer space gets transformed from a mythic arena into an arena of other stars and planets, as opposed to the way we had thought about the heavens before. But the Greeks actually had the idea 2,500 years ago. Now, interestingly, the Greeks had mythology about the origins of technology. And that mythology, as I mentioned already, centered around Hephaestus, who was the god of metallurgy. And Hephaestus, for example, created what people will say is the first robot in ancient history, Talus. And there's an image up there of Talus. And Talus, in fact, figures in the story Jason and the Argonauts. But Hephaestus made all kinds of moving mechanical devices, including Apollo's chariot and the wings of Mercury, according to Greek mythology. So he was responsible for early inventive and fantastical technologies, and it's told within a mythic form. But notice that these are ideas that will become part of contemporary science fiction, wondrous technologies. And wondrous technologies, the idea of it goes all the way back to Hephaestus, where technology empowers us. The Greeks were also into mathematics, geometry, such as Archimedes. There were other mythic stories about inventive technology, such as the story of Daedalus and his son Icarus. And Daedalus creates wings that he attaches on to his son Icarus, so that Icarus could fly up into the air. But he warns Icarus that don't fly too close to the sun, because the wax will melt on your arms and you'll fall into the sea. But Icarus, being an independent young individual who wants to challenge the gods, so to speak, he flies too close to the sun, the wax melts, and he dies and falls into the sea. And of course, I've already mentioned the story of Hephaestus and Talus. And just in that context, I want to bring up again, it was easy for people then, and it's still easy for people now, because of this mythic heritage we have in us, to look at machines, or to be inclined to see machines as having personalities, animism. And so it's quite natural that the ancient Greeks envisioned technological beings that had personas or personalities, because that's a fundamental feature that shows up in human consciousness, to attribute personalities to machines. Finally, we come to the most important person within ancient Greek philosophy, Plato. And Plato was a dualist, separating mind and spirit from the physical world. That dualism influences Christianity. Christianity takes it up. Plato also has an important role in the development of utopian thinking, because the first utopia is actually the Republic, an ideal society. It greatly influenced H.G. Wells when H.G. Wells wrote Utopias. The problem with the Republic was that it was static, it was top down, it was ruled by philosopher kings, there was no democracy, and if you didn't agree with the philosopher kings, the guardians would, through force, enforce the rules of the guardian of the philosopher kings. So a lot of people will see Plato's Utopia as actually an archetype of dystopias, because a lot of modern dystopias really come down to a top-down, hierarchical, authoritarian kind of system that Plato, in fact, envisioned as an ideal. And now let's just sort of focus in on Prometheus, who I've already introduced, because I said Prometheus was of great significance in the history of science fiction. People in ancient times generally believed in either a cyclic theory of time, things just circle around, or they believed in a downward theory of time, that once there was a golden age and things have just gotten worse. But there was also another view on time which began to emerge with the ancient Greeks, and that was a linear view of time and a progressive view of time, that we were rising and ascending from a state of barbarism in the past, and we're moving forward and progressing. And this would become the dominant view of time, the dominant form of temporal consciousness when we come up to modern times. But it actually goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Hesiod, in fact, when he describes Prometheus as a titan, as the titan who stole fire from Hephaestus, actually, that's who stole it from, presumably brought technology and reason to humanity. So Prometheus is the is identified mythically as the source of human progress and self-determined progress among us. That is, we were children of the gods until Prometheus gave us reason and fire, and then we became masters of our own destiny. The historian Nisbet says that, in fact, it was the Greeks who first highlighted and emphasized the importance of growth and development, as opposed to simply decline and circling around. And Aristotle, who was a naturalist and studied nature, also believed in the idea of things develop and self-actualize and move forward. So in the ancient Greeks, we find this notion of progress, growth, and development emerging, which is key to modern science fiction. Now, how? Many science fiction historians will say that modern science fiction begins, modern, in like the last few centuries, when we recognize the pervasiveness of change, that the world tomorrow will be not the same as today. Indeed, the philosopher Heraclitus, who lived long before Aristotle or Plato, emphasized change as being the fundamental feature of reality. The only thing that stays the same is that nothing stays the same. And so the Greeks, in fact, all the way back to Heraclitus, were not only emphasizing growth and development, but with Heraclitus, they're emphasizing the ubiquitousness of change. And that is a key element to contemporary science fiction. Above and beyond and different now than a simply cyclic theory of time, a cyclic temporal consciousness, which was the prevalent mode of consciousness in ancient times. Now I come to Democritus and Lucretius, and I could say a lot about them, but I'll just sort of try to summarize it real quick, in that Lucretius, who was influenced by the materialistic philosopher Democritus, believed that nature was evolutionary, that man was evolutionary, that we had shown progress, and he gave a completely naturalistic explanation of it and totally rejected the idea of a supernatural realm as guiding us in our own evolution. And so by the time we get to Lucretius, and that's him down in the right-hand corner there, we have this notion that we live in a material world which is progressing forward and humanity is steering the ship, and that there are no gods and goddesses influencing us from above. And so notice how this is just taking this mode of consciousness, this Apollonian mode of consciousness, this abstract theoretic mode of consciousness, and developing it to the point where Lucretius says that gods were invented by man out of fear of death, or fear of death, yes. Odysseus, going back to him, is an example of the ideas of triumph and tragedy in ancient Greek mythology. And by that I mean that if we look at ancient Greek narratives, we'll find examples of heroes who conquer, who achieve, but we'll also find examples of tragedy, and lots of great works of tragedy in the ancient Greeks. Now, what's at work here is a new mode of consciousness, because if we take responsibility for our existence and we see ourselves as determining the future and determining progress, then we could fail or we could succeed. If we're being directed by the gods, this kind of, these two kinds of narratives would not emerge, because in fact, we're not responsible. But by becoming responsible and sometimes failing, our narratives now enrich, so we could have triumphs and we could have tragedies. And both triumphs and tragedies are two fundamental narrative forms in science fiction. And I had already mentioned that in Hesiod's Theogony, the Titans, the Olympian gods revolt against the Titans. And that's the archetype of the child revolting against the parent. And the story of Prometheus, in fact, is the same story, now for the next generation. Prometheus, which in the Greek means foresight, brings to humanity self-determination. Zeus punishes Prometheus, but also punishes humanity by unleashing Pandora and Pandora's box, which she opens up upon humanity. And so we get our self-determination, we get our power, but we get all the woes of the world. And interestingly then, Prometheus as a myth, where mankind now transcends the deities, is a myth about the end of myth. It's where we self-emancipate from our mythic parents who presumably created us, inform us, and structure our consciousness. Now, what time do we have right now, Terry? I don't have a watch in front of me.
Hold on, Tom. It's I have 47 of.
Okay, all right. We'll do one more part and then we'll take a little break. Okay. The Battle of Beings of the Moon and the Sun. I'm writing about things I have never seen, nor experienced, or heard tell from anybody else. Things, what is more, that do not in fact exist, nor can exist at all. So my readers must not believe a word I say. That is the beginning of Lucian's true history. And Lucian's true history is frequently identified as the first, or one of the, or at least the most important early science fiction-like narratives, because in Lucian's True History, which was written sometime between 125 and 180 after the Common Era, AD, Lucian tells a story of a trip to the moon. Now, other people had imagined stories back then of going to the moon. And it's an expression of extraordinary voyages and adventures and the desire to see strange and unusual realms. Lucian envisions his characters going to the moon, and he gives a rather naturalistic explanation for how they get to the moon on a spout of water, where they encounter fantastical realities, but he creates this as a satire because he doesn't think the kinds of things that he describes in the story could possibly be true any more than he thinks the kinds of fantastical beings that are described in ancient mythology could be true, because Lucian is at least strongly inclined toward the naturalistic, having been influenced by Epicurus, Democritus, and Lucretius. So he is of a scientific mind making a joke about the fantastical mythic side of human consciousness, and he creates this story in order to illustrate it. But the story is highly imaginative. That is, we have alien worlds, the moon, and also Venus and the sun, where there are alien life forms, of which there are many different kinds, including giant fleas and ants. And he talks about beings who come from the star Sirius, as well as beings who come from the moon and from the sun. So he has lots of different kinds of strange aliens. He creates a gigantic interplanetary war with beings from the moon, the sun, and other worlds. So this is the first space opera in the primordial sense of it. The beings of the moon and the sun fight with each other over who is going to colonize Venus. He invents all kinds of strange technologies in this. He has giant spiders in outer space who make space webs that connect the planets together. And he has all of these bizarre weapons, including weapons that are made out of giant asparagus. And he also envisions a telescope. And he envisions the idea of colonizing new planets, in this case here, Venus. And he has various strange patterns of behavior and physiology in his aliens. He has women who grow from roots out of the ground on the moon. He has males who are the only sex, males who give birth, but they give birth out of their calves and they have wooden penises, and various other strange and inventive things. So I think I got one little thing. He blends together naturalistic speculations with lots of mythic and theological dimensions into this story. And in fact, this story you could read, the bulk of it you can get from either the internet or various collections. And it's a very fascinating thing to read because it's 2,000 years old and it's very bizarre and very strange with all kinds of unusual things in it. But fundamentally, he's talking about a space adventure and aliens and worlds in outer space. And all of that is extremely obviously prescient and contributory to the evolution of science fiction. He lays down a lot of the kinds of themes and ideas that would later emerge full force in contemporary science fiction.